As the Second World War went on, more and more nations were dragged into the fray, and the situation became ever more complex. In every nation, to some degree or another, there were divided loyalties. In Scandinavia and the Low Countries, the Germans saw thousands of volunteers flock to their cause, despite the fact that the Germans themselves had just invaded their countries. The vast majority of volunteers for the German cause were obviously European, but this wasn't exclusively the case. Much of the non-white world had grievances against Britain and France. After all, those two empires essentially ruled all of Africa and Asia between them. It's no surprise then that some Indians and Muslims decided to throw in their lot with the Germans. In the East, too, there were thousands of disaffected Muslims of both the white and non-white variety, which had a bone to pick with the Soviet Union, or even their own neighbours. In almost every case, non-white or Muslim units turned out to be an absolute disaster. Himmler was once heard to remark that the only thing his Bosnians had learned in SS training was how to stop stealing from each other. Regardless, the Muslim volunteers to Hitler's cause are worth looking at, since the topic is one which has barely been touched. The Albanian and Bosnian formations are worth looking at in their own subsequent videos, but for everyone else, this is the complete history of Hitler's Muslim volunteers. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, this video is in no way, shape, or form political, and is purely a work of history. Please don't ever think it. Thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to those of you who have signed up to my Subscribe Star, or as a YouTube member. About a month ago, my Patreon was arbitrarily banned, and before then, that website was my main income source. Thanks to a huge outpouring of support from you guys, however, much of the damage has now been made up, as so many of you made the switch over to the other sites. So if you had ever considered signing up, or were previously signed up to my Patreon, then please do consider signing up to my Subscribe Star, or as a YouTube member, and one of the links in the description. Even the lowest tier helps more than you can imagine, and without your kind support, I simply wouldn't be able to make these videos. Thank you. Islam was not something that had ever really been on the German radar. At the time, Germany was still an overwhelmingly Christian country. Many had become cultural Christians, and some, like many key SS men, began to dream of some kind of vague pre-Christian religious direction for their new Reich. Islam, however, was something extremely distant and foreign. The only Muslims in the country at that time, really, would have been diplomats and their families. War, however, had brought the Germans into contact with these populations, of which they knew very little about. First and foremost, these Islamists were to be found in the Balkans, as Germany absolutely flattened Yugoslavia in a matter of days in April 1941. Germany had, of course, had some involvement with Islam before. There was the long and drawn-out history of repelling these non-European invaders time and again for centuries. With the First World War, however, the Germans and the Turks, in this instance, found themselves on the same side for once. When the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, the Sultan proclaimed a jihad, aka a holy war, upon the Entente powers. Great Britain, France, and Russia all had significant Muslim populations in their empires, and this move had significant potential to cause absolute chaos in the form of a massive fifth column. The Kaiser knew this as well as anyone, and was more than happy to exploit it, and wasted no time doing so. Agents quickly headed eastwards, spreading propaganda and inciting revolts wherever they went. Many Muslims were told that the Kaiser had secretly converted to Islam, and that the Germans would supply them with arms and guarantee their future freedom. All of this was nonsense, but to some degree it had an effect, as 4 entire companies mutinied in Singapore, and Muslims began to desert from hitherto loyal regiments, such as the Indian Army's 129th Punjabis. By the middle of 1915, the British Indian Army refused to send any more Indian troops to Europe due to the fear of disaffection spreading. The British instead had to look for more whites at home to throw into the meat grinder. The distractions continued throughout the coming years as Islamic rebellions kicked off in western Egypt, Sudan, and Somaliland. Valuable resources had to be diverted to easily crush these sideshows. The Ethiopians, too, were working with the Germans and considered invading British Somaliland. To overcome this, precious resources had to be spent arranging a coup in Ethiopia. The Germans eventually couldn't keep up with such shenanigans as the war, and especially the Middle Eastern front, turned against them. Regardless, very few resources had resulted in very big distractions, and lessons had been learned for next time. During the Second World War, most Balkan nations fell in line rather quickly. Yugoslavia was amongst them, but this was rapidly reversed with a coup led by the military high command. Yugoslavia, then, found herself quickly swallowed up and dismembered as issue of Poland in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Albanians of the Balkans found themselves under Italian control, but the Muslims of Bosnia now found themselves under the newly born Croatian puppet state. At the time of the German invasion, there was around 2.5 million Bosnians. Just over a million of these were Muslim. Initially, there was some optimism, as Ante Pavlic, the leader of the new Croatian state, spoke of equality between the state's Catholics and Muslims. From almost day one, though, this proved illusory, and civil war ensued. There was already two major resistance movements in the region. One was the Serb-dominated Chetniks, led by Draza Mihailovic. The second was the communist partisans led by Tito, who was a Croat. Caught up in the middle of all this was the Bosnian Muslims, who found themselves persecuted by all sides in this triumvirate war. The story of Muslim volunteers did not begin here, though, but rather in the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June, 1941, the Germans were once again driving east, and Alfred Rosenberg, the Germans' leading racial philosopher, was granted a government ministry of his own, the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories. His actual control on the ground was rather limited, and real control belonged to the all-powerful Reich Commissars and military commanders in the field. Theoretically, these men reported to Rosenberg that this was far from a perfect system. Rosenberg tended to be far more realistic when it came to dealing with the ethnicities of the East. He saw the Soviet Union as a ridiculous, arbitrary construct, and believed that it needed to be split up into its constituent ethnic parts. Many of these new nations would to some degree be under German hegemony as satellites, but regardless, this was a lot better than their current lot in life. Included in this was to be the populations of the southern Soviet Union, which included not only Christians such as the Georgians and Armenians, but also the Muslims of Crimea, the Caucasus, and the vast Turkic steppes. Rosenberg called for the independence of the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Belarus, as well as these other minorities. Few other leading Germans would agree with Rosenberg's rather benevolent approach, despite Rosenberg being by far the best qualified man for the job, given his own Baltic German background. Regardless, Rosenberg would fight their corner, but for now, the future of all the ethnic groups in the East were very much up in the air, as the Germans pushed ever eastwards. In 1941, even Frenchmen weren't qualified for the Waffen-SS. This was to be an exclusively Germanic affair, at least for now. The Muslims of the East, then, were a million miles away from being seen as Waffen-SS material. They, like the French and the Spanish, were to serve as foreign volunteers under the German army, the Heer. The Muslims of the East had never had a happy time under Russian rule. For centuries before Muscovy began its glorious expansion eastwards, it had been on the receiving end of endless Muslim harassment. A simply incalculable number of ethnic Russians have been slaughtered, or, worse, enslaved and taken off to the east, never to return. The Muslims had set quite the standard. The shoe, eventually, was on the other foot, and the Tsar's writ ran from the Baltic states and Finland all the way to the Pacific, the biggest land empire on Earth. An ever-increasing wave of Russian migration filtered into the Central Asian region, and the local Muslim discontent grew ever greater. In 1916, tensions boiled over in Kazakhstan, and mobs of Kazakhs began to slaughter Russian and Cossack settlers and burnt their homes and crops. Despite being engaged in the brutal offensive all the way in Belarus, the Tsar's army reacted forcefully, and within 2 months, 300,000 Kazakhs had been driven into the mountains, or over the border into China. 80,000 of them tried to return the following year, but they were met by Russian troops who butchered them in their thousands. When the communists came to power, things were no better. Initially, the Central Asian republics were granted some degree of autonomy, but this was quickly crushed, and the hated land collectivization policies were enforced on the locals. In the famine of 1921 to 1922, nearly 1 million Kazakhs alone died of hunger, never mind all the others. Alongside this, the traditional Muslim way of running society was being obliterated, as the old elite, consisting of tribal clan leaders, were dispossessed, and the Bolsheviks sought to impose atheism upon their Muslim subjects. Mosques were closed, imams were arrested, and the Quran was suppressed. In Turkestan, the country was officially dissolved in 1924. Russian was imposed as the official language, and all the various Turkic languages were outright banned. Worst hit of all had to be the Kazakhs. Between the revolution and the outbreak of the Second World War, the population had been reduced by 22%. Anti-Soviet sentiment, then, was not in short supply. The Germans, meanwhile, were having manpower difficulties almost from the get-go once they plunged into the eastern abyss. All the theory of the pre-war years in terms of racial hierarchy had gone out the window when it came to this struggle. Increasingly, any man of any race became eligible to be thrown into the fray, as it became clear that this was not going to be a blitzkrieg, but rather a long, drawn-out, costly affair. Barely a fortnight into the invasion, the 134th Infantry Division was openly signing up ex-Red Army personnel, and soon enough, every German unit, down to platoon level, had its official or unofficial Hiwis, short for willing helpers, who did everything from digging latrines and trenches to carrying rations and ammunition. Soon enough, many of these men began active participation in combat. In concert with Rosenberg, the OKH established the concept of ethnic legions for non-Russian volunteers. This included Caucasian Christians, such as Armenians and Georgians, but also legions for the Azeris, Chechens, and Ingush, as well as Turkic units composed of steppe people. These units were to be nominally attached to the 162nd Infantry Division, which was based in occupied Slovenia. Collectively, the new formations were referred to as the 162nd Turkmen Division, and they even had their own weekly newspaper called Freedom. Appealing to these types was a big deal to Rosenberg, who wanted to form a Caucasian Reichskommissariat, before eventually giving these people independence, or something close to it. A Free Caucasus campaign was launched, in which posters, leaflets, and radio broadcasts were used to win over Caucasian soldiers fighting in the Red Army. Initially, this campaign was actually rather successful in attracting recruits from the hordes of deserters and POWs. To provide some kind of political legitimacy for the recruitment drive, Rosenberg even set up national committees, which had a liaison staff at Rosenberg's ministry. All of this could have borne fruit had Himmler not staunchly opposed Rosenberg's efforts. Rosenberg wanted to stoke the fires of latent nationalism and anti-communism to help Germany win the war, whereas Himmler saw things much more in the vein of conqueror and conquered. As the war progressed, Himmler's power only grew, whilst Rosenberg's diminished. As these two battled it out over occupation policy behind the scenes, the army had to deal with the real practicalities of fighting. There was an ever-increasing number of Muslims volunteering for service in the Wehrmacht, and they had to do something with them. On the 13th of January 1942, the Turkestan Caucasian Mohammedan Legion was formed. At that time, the majority of the Legion's volunteers were Azeris, and their numbers continued to swell to the point that the Azeri Legion was formed on the 22nd of July that same year. The original Legion was renamed to the Turkestan Legion. Separately, in occupied Poland at this time, the Volga Tatar Legion was formed. These various legions were only half of the story. For every Muslim who went to serve in the new formations, many more stayed with the German frontline divisions that recruited them as Hiwis. Only rarely would these men form distinct outfits, such as those in the far south after the conquest of Crimea, when there was a recruitment drive amongst the region's 5 million Tatars. 6 entire battalions were raised and used to fight local partisans. On the 28th of June 1942, Case Blue was launched, and the Germans threw themselves into the Caucasus. For the first time since Crimea, the invaders began to come across large populations of Muslims. In general, these Muslims were well disposed to the invaders and greeted them more like liberators. The stay down south was to be short-lived, as the sheer size of the Soviet Union proved too much for the German war machine to bear. Regardless, the newly captured areas practiced a model occupation designed to win over local support. In the Karachay region, one of Rosenberg's national committees was set up. The Muslim holy day of Bayram was celebrated on the 11th of October in Kisladovsk via an exchanging of gifts between the German commanders and their Muslim hosts. On the 18th of December, the Kerman festival was celebrated by both parties, as Rosenberg's representative in the region, Bräutigam, led the German delegation. A Balkayer nobleman even presented one of the famous Balkayer mountain horses to the Germans as a personal gift for Hitler. Those who collaborated were playing a risky game. A company of Turkmen volunteers were based in the village of Sereskaya during the winter of 1942. They could not be reached by radio, and so a German patrol was dispatched to investigate. Inside a hut, the entire company was eventually found lying in their beds, minus their heads. On the wall was written, "Traitors will not escape revenge." Further north, the Battle of Stalingrad was underway, and both sides had their contingents of Asians. The Kazakhs, on the Soviet side alone, made up 5 entire rifle divisions. In Central Asia, there was an enforced levée en masse, as the NKVD forced everyone who they could get their hands on into the mix. These fellows could barely speak Russian, and the 196th Rifle Division was almost entirely wiped out. The losses were horrendous, and huge numbers of Central Asians died without even knowing the names of their own officers. Thousands, quite rightly, chose to flee to attempt to escape the horror. The German contingent was of course much smaller. 6th Army had over 50,000 Hiwis in its ranks, including 3 battalions of Turkmen. All 3 would go on to fight until the last man after being encircled that winter. They knew what fate awaited them if they surrendered. Alongside them were other Muslim volunteers. One German officer in the hotly contested factory district reported, quote, "Especially brave with the Tatars. As anti-tank gunners using a captured Russian weapon, they were proud of every Soviet tank they hit. These fellows were fantastic," end quote. These Muslims were much better trained, much better led, and much better motivated than their comrades across the way, being used as infinite cannon fodder. There were an awful lot of them, but their history is essentially lost to time. The NKVD sent entire companies into the still smoking ruins after the surrender. Any Muslims found were either shot out of hand or marched off to their deaths. The columns of skeletal prisoners were also scanned by the NKVD. For the most part, the Muslims were simply plucked from amongst their German comrades and shot. As the Germans retreated westwards, a horde of Muslim villagers chose to join them. They'd only known their occupiers for a couple of months, yet they figured it was worth chancing it. Anything was better than the Soviets. Needless to say, many thousands perished on the way from cold, hunger, and partisan attacks. By now, the use of Muslim troops had long since been streamlined in the German army. In July 1941, Hitler had proclaimed, quote, "It must always remain a cast-iron principle that none but Germans shall be allowed to bear arms. Even when, at first sight, it may seem expedient to summon foreign peoples to arms, it would be folly to do so. One day, it would be sure to prove our absolute and irretrievable undoing." End quote. In reality, however, no one listened to this order, nor did they listen to the 10th of February 1942 order, in which the Führer forbid the enlistment of any more Osttruppen. By midsummer of 1942, it was decided to regularize the Easterners in terms of pay, rations, ranks, decorations, and dress. The volunteers, including the Muslims, were to be eligible for all German awards. The only minor difference was that they couldn't wear the German emblem of the eagle clutching a swastika, which every member of the Wehrmacht wore above their right breast pocket. This was where Hitler drew the line. Each legion had its own cap cockade and arm shield, usually in the nation's colours with the national symbol. The Turkmen, for example, had an arm shield depicting a famous mosque from Samarkand. In August 1942, General Ernst Kostring was appointed Inspector General of Turkic and Caucasian forces. This could have been a big deal, but ultimately his entire staff consisted of one staff officer, one driver, and one clerk. 4 months later, his remit was broadened, but he still had no real command responsibilities. By the summer of 1944, there were close to 1 million Osttruppen officially recorded across the Heer, Luftwaffe, and even the Kriegsmarine. Little record was kept of all these men, and they remain barely even footnotes in even the most detailed of military histories. But regardless, they were there. Elsewhere throughout these years, there had been a small contingent of volunteers in North Africa, who mostly signed up as a way to escape hunger and grinding poverty. Only once were they really put into the line, during Operation Torch, and even then, the Germans thought that they were with the Allies, and so they opened fire upon them. The Allies, too, then began firing on the same position. From then on, these Arabs were used in rear area duties, such as the construction of defensive positions. Most ended up being taken captive by the Allies alongside their German comrades. Enough of a cadre of the 845th German Arab Battalion had managed to escape, however, and they were reconstituted and sent to Greece to fight partisans during the spring and summer of 1944. With the Soviets closing in, they were to evacuate with the rest of the Germans and were harried by Tito's men amongst other various partisan groups as they made their way through the Balkans. Here, for the first time, the Arabs did themselves justice in combat. The Arabs were involved in bitter fighting in Serbia amidst deep snow and biting cold. It was here, in Uzis, that they seized a prominent local feature, Hill 734, from Tito's men. This allowed the German retreat to continue. By war's end, they found themselves in Bosnia, and the few survivors simply surrendered to the local partisans. Amazingly, they were not shot out of hand. They were put in camps and then quietly repatriated to their home countries a year later. In 1943, the SS began to take over responsibility for the foreign volunteers, and the core of the former legions were now used to create much larger formations, such as the SS Wallonian and the SS Langmark. Even this major expansion was not enough for Himmler, and he now cast his eye further afield. The Reichsführer SS had been impressed by the bravery of the Muslim troops during the invasion of the Caucasus, and especially their performance during the bitter winter retreat. During the siege of Kharkov, a Turkmen battalion had lost their beloved German commander, and they voluntarily went back into the city, purely to collect his body for an honourable burial. Acts like this meant a lot to Himmler, and the idea of a Turkic Muslim SS division began to go through his mind. As always, when it came to foreign volunteers, Himmler turned to Gottlob Berger to begin recruitment. Immediately, he cast his eye upon the Reinforced Turkestani Infantry Battalion 450, an already existing German army unit. This unit had served in southern Russia during the winter of 1941, and then again in 1942. During both occasions, the battalion made a name for itself by acting horrendously against the local civilian population. After the disaster at Stalingrad, no one particularly wanted anything to do with the unit, and its commander had been booted for incompetence. For now, it was simply left to kick its heels in the rear. the unit was a total disaster. When Gottlob Berger began to express an interest, the army would obviously have been quite relieved. Surprisingly, Berger was also interested in the Turkmen's former commander, Major Andreas Meyer-Mader. In November 1943, a meeting was set up between Himmler, Meyer-Mader, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The Mufti was asked to give a new combat division of Turkic Muslim SS his blessing and spiritual guidance. The meeting went well and was followed up on the 14th of December 1943. Here, Meyer-Mader was promised a promotion and a free hand in recruitment. Meyer-Mader agreed and was made an SS Obersturmbannführer. For now, this was to be the 94th SS Regiment, and it was hoped that in future the unit would become division-sized. Meyer-Mader immediately set about tempting his men over from his old unit, as well as other existing Turkic, Azeri, and Tatar Osttroppen units. POW camps were also trawled through, as well as the endless ranks of Hiwis. Eventually, 3,000 men were in training with the unit. By spring of 1944, they were still training, but were hampered by a lack of equipment. With the general supply situation in the Reich, it was difficult to see when the unit would ever get the first-class German arms which they had been promised. Even uniforms were scarce, and many of the men had no boots. In March of that year, the unit was renamed to the 1st East Mussulman SS Regiment. It was decided that some of the unit was now ready to take part in an upcoming anti-partisan offensive in Belarus, and so around 550 men were shipped to the town of Uratishki near Minsk and prepared for combat. Northeast of Minsk, there was believed to be around 14,000 partisans, and the plan was to surround and then destroy them. The operation was to have two parts: Operation Rain Shower and Operation Spring Festival. There was quite a variety of units involved in this action, including the infamous SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger and the Kaminsky Brigade. The Muslim contingent was actually placed under the control of SS Standartenführer Oskar Dirlewanger himself. His unit was by now only 434 men strong, and so the 550-strong Muslim contingent was much appreciated. Right from the get-go, the men of the Sonderkommando were burning villages and confiscating livestock, amongst other atrocities. Just like before, Meyer-Mader was unable to control his troops, and they were essentially led on a bloody rampage by Dirlewanger. Bitter fighting broke out as the SS advanced north, and a handful of villages were contested during the last few weeks of April and into early May. On the 2nd of May, there was further fighting at the village of Horovo-Wiersinski, and it was here that SS Obersturmbannführer Andreas Meyer-Mader was reported KIA. He was the only German reported killed in the action, and nobody else was even wounded. None of his men even seemed to have been involved in any combat that day. Throughout the entire month-long operation, the entire SS Sonderkommando had lost 19 men killed and 43 wounded. Meyer-Mader's death, then, was extremely bizarre and shrouded in mystery. The Turks had by now gained a reputation even worse than Dirlewanger's, and they had actually managed to outshine him during the operation, in terms of the pure horror they inflicted on the locals. Now, with the death of their incompetent leader, their morale hit rock bottom. He had made a serious effort to understand them, their cultures and traditions, and had even learnt some of their languages. He was unable to translate this into a serious and efficient fighting unit, but regardless he was much loved. No matter what he tried, he could never seem to get his men under control, whether that be in the army or in the SS. The nature of the Turkic troops, it seemed, simply could not be changed. Wherever they went, atrocity followed. The regiment was now withdrawn from action and confined to barracks for a desperately needed reorganization. Here, SS Hauptsturmführer Billig took charge and immediately decided that in order to stiffen the unit's resolve, he had to weed out undesirable elements. An SS military court was convened, and large numbers of the unit were tried for insubordination. 78 were found guilty and shot. Even the SS authorities found this excessive, and Billig was promptly replaced by SS Hauptsturmführer Hermann after less than a month in charge, and he tried to brush the whole ordeal under the carpet. There was little enthusiasm to throw the Turks back into the fray, but this changed on the 22nd of June 1944 as the Soviets launched Operation Bagration in an attempt to swallow up Belarus. Every unit was promptly thrown into the line, and fighting the partisans became of secondary importance. The Kampfgruppe von Gottberg was once again thrown in, and just like last time, the Turkmen were attached to Dirlewanger's Sonderkommando. Minsk fell on the 3rd of July, and there was a gaping hole in the German line. In order to hold the flanks, the Kampfgruppe was ordered northwest, but ended up retreating along the railway line towards Warsaw in order not to be encircled. Here, the Turks found themselves part of a counterattack with Dirlewanger on the flank of the assaulting Soviet 26th Tank Corps. To the surprise of everyone, this checked the Russian advance. The Soviets soon got over their initial shock, however, and the Turks were forced to withdraw a few days later, with orders to dig in on the city of Grodno. These orders were simply ignored, and the Turkmen continued retreating westwards to Leich in East Prussia. The Turks, however, would soon be thrown back into the mix. On the 1st of August at 5 p.m., the Warsaw Uprising began. From the very beginning, Muslim soldiers and the Wehrmacht were involved in the bloodbath. A unit of Azeris were even surrounded in their barracks, and, after a heroic last stand, they gave in and surrendered. With their hands raised, the Azeris were then butchered where they stood as the Poles slit their throats. Other Azeris were also involved in the fighting in Warsaw, and the 1st East Mussulman SS regiment was thrown in from Leik to take their part in the chaos as well. Just as before, they were alongside Derlewanger, and given that this was perhaps Derlewanger's most famous horror show, it's safe to say that the Turks inflicted their fair share of horrors upon the Poles too. There was very little record of the fighting in Warsaw, such was the confusion at that time, but either way, the Turks' hands were certainly stained with blood. August 1944 saw not one Slavic revolt, but two. Further south, there was a general uprising by some disaffected elements of the Slovak armed forces. Many units, which had just finished their butchery in Warsaw, were now taken south to take part in this new campaign. Some members of the Mussulman regiment were already in Slovakia regardless, but now they were reunited with both their comrades and Derlewanger. The fighting here was nowhere near as fierce as in Warsaw, and once more, the records make it unclear which atrocities were Derlewanger's and which were the Turks'. The uprising was crushed rapidly, and the regiment remained in Slovakia and continued training until Christmas. This rest came with a new commander too, in the form of SS Standartenführer Harun al-Rashid Bey. Bey was formerly known as Wilhelm Hintersatz and was an Austrian with an extensive knowledge of Islam. As the name suggests, he even converted. The Turks, however, immediately took against him. Discontent continued to bubble up until eventually things came to a head on Christmas Eve as an armed mutiny broke out. Some 450 members of the regiment's 1st Battalion killed several of their NCOs and fled to join the resistance in the hills. 300 of these ended up turning back to face their punishment. The leader of the revolt, Obersturmbannführer Gulam Azimov, was promptly shot by the partisans upon making contact with them. His men, however, were accepted. After all this, there was nothing else for Himmler to do but disband the unit. The entire experiment had been a disaster. There were some other small Muslim units, which are barely worth covering, but the main two formations of note were the Albanian and Bosnian SS, both of which are worth their own videos, which I'll be making shortly after this one. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. An especially big thank you to those of you who have signed up to my subscribe star or as a YouTube member, and one of the links in the description. Without you, these videos wouldn't be possible, and I cannot thank you enough. Cheers.